The Richmond District Courthouse stood like a weathered monument under the gray Virginia sky, its brick facade carrying the weight of history and secrets. Inside, the air was heavy with the hum of bureaucracy. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed. Overhead, the faint scent of stale coffee mingled with the polish of linoleum floors, and the rhythmic clank of metal detectors echoed through the halls. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where people shuffled through security, their faces dulled by routine, settling onto hard wooden benches to wait out another day of justice or its absence. Most tried not to fall asleep. Some whispered nervously, their voices swallowed by the cavernous room. But today, something was different. Something was waiting to break. In the courtroom, a police brutality trial was unfolding, one of countless cases that had become all too familiar in Richmond. A young black man had been beaten during a routine traffic stop. His story reduced to a grainy video clip with no audio, his voice drowned in a sea of legal motions and skeptical glances. The officers sat smugly behind their polished badges, their uniforms crisp, their expressions untouched by doubt. The victims, meanwhile, sat trembling, their stories dissected by lawyers who seemed more interested in procedure than truth. And in the midst of this familiar theater, one woman sat silently on the left side of the room, her presence unremarkable to the untrained eye. Her name was Olivia Harper. Olivia, 34, was unassuming at first glance. Her clothes were simple: a navy blouse, dark slacks, nothing extravagant. Her natural curls were pulled back neatly, and a pair of glasses rested lightly above her forehead. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her posture straight but not rigid, her eyes sharp but calm. To the casual observer, she was just another witness, another face in the crowd of a city that had seen too many trials like this. But there was something about her stillness, something in the way her gaze swept the room without lingering, that hinted at a purpose far beyond what anyone could guess. The officer at the center of the trial, David Coleman, leaned back in his chair, his broad frame filling the space with an arrogance that needed no words. 17 years with the Richmond Police Department had made him untouchable, or so he believed. His jaw was set like a steel trap, his eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who owned it. He'd built a career on bending the system to his will, intimidating witnesses, cutting corners, and turning street stops into headline arrests that rarely held up in court. Complaints piled up in his file, but they never stuck. Dash cams malfunctioned. Witnesses disappeared. And powerful friends in high places like Judge Robert Thornton, presiding over the trial, ensured his name stayed clean. Coleman's gaze landed on Olivia as she rose to take her seat near the witness stand. He tilted his head, a smirk curling his lips, and muttered loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Who let the maid in here?" A few chuckles rippled through the room, nervous and low. He didn't stop. Leaning toward another officer, he added, "This ain't a cleaning shift, sweetheart. Better not try to mop the witness stand." More laughter, sharper this time, from a handful of spectators and officers. A few others stared at their shoes, pretending not to hear. Coleman turned to Olivia, his smirk widening. "Hope you brought your green card." "Oh, wait, you probably don't need one. Y'all always slip through anyway." The room froze. The whispers died. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Olivia stood still, her eyes locked on Coleman's with a cold, unyielding intensity that seemed to pull the air from his lungs. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't speak. Her silence was louder than his words, a wall of resolve that made the chuckles falter and the smirks fade. With a single deliberate nod, she took her seat and waited for the judge, her hands folded calmly in her lap. No outburst, no tears, no reaction, just patience. But what Coleman didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Olivia Harper wasn't just another witness. She wasn't a bystander caught in the crosshairs of his cruelty. She was there by design, every step calculated, every moment orchestrated. For months, perhaps years, she had been watching, listening, documenting. She wasn't just in that courtroom to testify. She was there to dismantle a system that had protected men like Coleman for far too long. The judge, Robert Thornton, sat high on his bench, his robes pristine, his reputation polished by 2 decades of rulings. On paper, he was impartial, a pillar of justice. But those who paid attention knew better. His rulings favored officers like Coleman, his objections rarely challenged. His courtroom a theater where the script was written long before the gavel fell. He flipped through his files, his eyes avoiding Olivia's, as if her presence was an inconvenience he could dismiss. He didn't stop Coleman's remarks. He didn't even look surprised. He just cleared his throat and moved the trial forward, in the back of the room. A young court clerk named Emily watched the exchange, her fingers tightening around her notepad. She was new, barely a month into the job, but she'd already heard the whispers about Coleman and Thornton, about cases that vanished, reports that never surfaced, and voices that were silenced before they could speak. Emily's eyes flickered to Olivia, catching the quiet strength in her posture, the way she seemed to absorb the insult without bending. For a moment, their gazes met, and Emily felt a pang of something she couldn't name: admiration, perhaps, or guilt for staying silent. Outside the courtroom, the city of Richmond carried on, its streets heavy with the weight of history. The James River flowed quietly, its surface hiding currents that could pull a person under. The courthouse, with its cracked sidewalks and imposing columns, stood as a symbol of order, but beneath its polished floors lay a rot that had festered for decades. Olivia knew this. She had studied it, mapped it, traced its veins through police reports, bank records, and whispered confessions. She wasn't just a witness to Coleman's cruelty. She was the architect of his reckoning. As the trial paused for a recess, Coleman leaned back, laughing with another officer, his voice carrying across the room. "She can cause all the trouble she wants," he said, loud enough for Olivia to hear. "Thornton's got my back. That girl could walk in here with the Constitution tattooed on her face, and it wouldn't matter." The officer beside him chuckled, but the sound was hollow, uneasy. They didn't notice the way Olivia's lips curved ever so slightly, a shadow of a smile that held no warmth. They didn't see the way her fingers brushed the edge of her satchel, where files and recordings waited like a loaded gun. In that moment, Olivia was invisible to them, just as she intended. But invisibility was her weapon. She had spent years learning to navigate rooms like this, where her skin and her gender made her a target, where her voice was dismissed before it was heard. She had fought for every inch of respect in a world that rarely offered it freely. And now, in this courtroom, she was ready to turn their arrogance against them. The recess ended, and the trial resumed. Olivia sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Somewhere in the room, a man in a plain suit watched her from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a lawyer, not a reporter, not a spectator. He was someone who knew more than he should, someone who had seen Olivia's name on a file marked classified. And as Coleman's laughter echoed one last time, that man slipped out of the courtroom, his phone already in hand. No one in that room realized, not Coleman, not Thornton, not even the nervous spectators, was that they had just witnessed the opening act of a storm that had been building for months, maybe years. A storm that would tear through the polished walls of Richmond's justice system and leave nothing untouched. Olivia Harper wasn't just a woman in a courtroom. She was the spark, the fuse, the reckoning. And by the end of this trial, the question wouldn't be who she was. It would be how no one had seen her coming. The Richmond night was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic along the James River. In a modest apartment tucked away from the city's clamor, Olivia Harper sat at a small kitchen table, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of a laptop screen. Papers were strewn across the surface: timelines, transcripts, redacted police reports, and grainy photos clipped neatly with color-coded tabs. A single cup of chamomile tea steamed beside her, untouched, as her fingers moved methodically across the keyboard. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but Olivia's eyes were sharp, unyielding, as if time were an adversary she'd long since mastered. She wasn't just a witness in that courtroom. She was a federal agent, and for the past 10 months, she'd been weaving a net to catch a system that thought itself untouchable. Olivia's role as a covert operative for the Department of Justice was a secret known only to a select few. Her assignment was clear: infiltrate the Richmond justice system, gather evidence of systemic corruption, and expose the network that had shielded men like David Coleman and Judge Robert Thornton for years. The operation was delicate, a house of cards built on patience and precision. One wrong move could unravel months of work, expose her, or worse, silence the truth forever. But Olivia was no stranger to high stakes. She had spent years navigating rooms where her presence was questioned, her voice dismissed, her skin a reason to be underestimated. And she had learned to turn that invisibility into a weapon. Her journey to this moment began in Baltimore, in a neighborhood where hope was as scarce as streetlights. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, one as a nurse, another as a cleaner, Olivia grew up knowing the cost of survival. At 16, she watched her younger brother, Jamal, dragged from a school bus by police on a trumped-up charge of loitering. He was a lanky kid with dreams of becoming a mechanic, but a single officer's word sent him to juvenile detention for 6 months. The charges were dropped eventually, but the damage was done. Jamal's spirit was cracked, his trust in the world shattered. Olivia never forgot the officer's face, the way he smirked as he cuffed her brother, or the way the system closed ranks to protect them. That memory was a fire in her chest, one she'd carried through college, law school, and into the DOJ, where she'd clawed her way into a role most never thought she'd reach. Now, in Richmond, that fire burned brighter than ever. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning a file labeled Coleman, David, Internal Affairs. It was thick with complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, witness intimidation, but every investigation had been marked inconclusive. Dashcams conveniently malfunctioned. Witnesses recanted or vanished. And Judge Thornton's signature appeared on too many dismissals to be coincidence. Olivia's fingers traced a highlighted line. A bank transfer, $10,000, deposited into an account linked to Thornton's cousin, tied to a case that never made it to trial. It was a thread, thin but unbreakable, and she'd been pulling at it for months. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a blocked number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice steady. Harper. A low, distorted voice crackled through. Stop digging or you'll regret it. The line went dead before she could respond. Olivia set the phone down, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Someone knew she was too close. She glanced at the window, the curtains drawn tight, and made a mental note to check the locks again. The threat wasn't new, but it was a reminder of the stakes. She wasn't just fighting Coleman and Thornton. She was up against a machine that protected its own, and it was starting to notice her. Across town, in a dimly lit federal building, Olivia met with her small task force. The room was sparse, with a long table covered in folders and a whiteboard strung with red thread connecting names, dates, and cases. Special Agent Sarah Nguyen, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for decoding financial trails, handed Olivia a printed summary. Thornton's been busy, Sarah said, her voice low. He approved 3 dismissals last week, all tied to Coleman's precinct. Same pattern. Complaints filed, then buried. Olivia skimmed the document, her lips tightening. He's not just covering for Coleman. He's protecting the whole operation. Natalie Carter, a young assistant district attorney, leaned forward. Her hands clasped tightly. I've seen it too. My files keep getting misplaced. Witnesses reassigned before they can testify. It's like the system's rigged from the inside. Natalie's frustration was palpable, her dark eyes burning with the same fire Olivia carried. She joined the operation after noticing too many cases vanish, her trust in the system eroding. With every tampered file. Together, they were building a case not just against Coleman and Thornton, but against the network that enabled them. A network that stretched higher than anyone wanted to admit. The door creaked open, and Michael Reed slipped inside, his hoodie pulled low over his face. A former cop who'd worked with Coleman years ago, Michael had resigned after a clash over an internal investigation. His hands trembled as he handed Olivia a flash drive. "This is everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Logs, photos, names, stuff they never wanted written down. "I don't want credit, just use it." Olivia took the drive, her eyes meeting his. "I will." Michael nodded, then glanced at the door. "They're watching me, Harper. Be careful." He left as quietly as he'd come, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Back at her apartment, Olivia plugged the drive into her laptop. The screen filled with files, audio clips of Coleman boasting about handling witnesses, photos of Thornton meeting with known fixers, and logs of internal training sessions where officers were taught to manage complaints. One clip stood out. Coleman's voice, casual and smug, saying, "Send it to Thornton. He'll bury it so deep you'll forget it ever existed." Olivia's jaw tightened. This was the piece she'd been waiting for, undeniable proof of collusion. But it wasn't enough. She needed impact, a moment so explosive it would crack the system open. And she was almost there. Her thoughts drifted to the courtroom, to Coleman's smirk and Thornton's indifference. They had humiliated her because they thought she was nobody, a black woman who could be dismissed with a laugh. But they didn't know about the night she'd spent poring over files, the risks she'd taken to meet informants, the weight of carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. They didn't know about Jamal, or the promise she'd made to herself the day he was released, that she'd never let another voice be silenced. That promise had brought her here, to a city steeped in injustice, to a courtroom where she was. Both hunter and prey. The next morning, Olivia returned to the courthouse, her satchel heavier with the weight of Michael's drive. She moved through the halls unnoticed, her plain clothes blending into the crowd of lawyers and clerks. But in a quiet corridor, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Two officers, their voices low, were discussing Coleman. "He's getting cocky," one said. "Thinks he's untouchable because Thornton's got his back." The other laughed. "Yeah, but that woman yesterday? She didn't look scared." "That's trouble." Olivia kept walking, her heart pounding, but her face a mask of calm. They were right. She wasn't scared. She was ready. That night, she met Natalie in a parked car near the river, away from prying eyes. Natalie handed her a folder. "This is from my office," she said. "Motions disappearing, witnesses reassigned. It's all connected to Thornton. But there's a name above him, William Foster." Olivia's eyes narrowed. Foster, the state attorney general, was a rising star, a self-proclaimed reformist whose speeches about justice filled the airwaves. If he was involved, the stakes were higher than she'd imagined. "We need more," Olivia said. "Something that ties in directly to Coleman and Thornton." Natalie nodded. "I'm working on it." "But Olivia, if we go after Foster, this won't just be Richmond's problem. It'll shake the whole state." Olivia leaned back, the river's dark surface reflecting the city's lights. She thought of Jamal, of the countless others whose stories had been buried under red tape and smug grins. She thought of the thread on her phone, the cars that lingered too long outside her apartment. And she thought of the courtroom, where Coleman's words had cut deeper than he could ever. "No, let it shake," she said finally, her voice steady. "Let it all come down." As she drove home, the city felt different, its shadow sharper, its silence heavier. Olivia knew the machine was watching her now, sensing the threat she posed. But she also knew something they didn't. Every insult, every laugh, every moment they thought they'd won was only tightening the noose around their necks. The courtroom wasn't just a stage for their arrogance. It was her battlefield, and she was ready to fight. The Richmond District Courthouse buzzed with an electric tension on the morning of the trial's final day. The air outside was thick with anticipation, a crowd swelling beyond the cracked sidewalks, reporters jostling for position, their cameras flashing like lightning, protesters clutching signs with names of forgotten victims, and curious onlookers whispering about the case that had begun to ripple through the city. Inside, the courtroom was a pressure cooker, every bench filled, every rustle of paper amplified. In the heavy silence, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the polished wood and worn linoleum, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. Something was about to break, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spark. Olivia Harper entered with the same quiet precision she'd carried all week, her navy blouse and slacks unassuming, her satchel clutched tightly at her side. Her curls were pulled back, her glasses resting lightly above her forehead, but her eyes, sharp, unyielding, betrayed the storm she was about to unleash. She took her seat on the witness side, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap, as if the weight of the moment were no heavier than the air she breathed. To the untrained eye, she was just another face in the crowd, a black woman whose presence had already been mocked and dismissed. But to those who knew how to look, her stillness was a warning, a coiled spring ready to snap. David Coleman sat near the front, his broad frame slouched with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, but his foot tapped restlessly against the floor, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade. He scanned Olivia's face, searching for weakness, his lips curling into a faint smirk as their eyes met. He leaned toward another officer, muttering something that drew a low chuckle, but the sound was hollow, less certain than before. Judge Robert Thornton presided from his elevated bench, his robes immaculate, his expression one of practiced neutrality. He flipped through files with deliberate slowness, avoiding Olivia's gaze, as if sensing the shift in the room but unwilling to acknowledge it. The young court clerk, Emily, sat at her station, her notepad clutched tightly, her knuckles white. She'd spent the week watching Olivia, piecing together fragments of whispers and glances, sensing that the woman in the simple blouse was more than she seemed. Emily's eyes flickered to the back of the room, where a man in a plain suit, the same one who'd slipped out during the first day, stood quietly, his phone no longer in hand but his presence unmistakable. He wasn't here to spectate. He was here to witness. The prosecutor, a wiry man with a reputation for tenacity, rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cutting through the silence. "Before we proceed with closing statements, the witness, Ms. Harper, would like to submit new evidence regarding this case. We've reviewed it and believe it is not only relevant but critical to the integrity of these proceedings." A murmur rippled through the room, heads turning toward Olivia. Thornton's fingers paused on his papers, his brow furrowing. "New evidence at this stage?" he asked, his tone laced with annoyance. "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. "It includes documentation, audio files, and internal communications directly tied to the witness's testimony and behavior observed during this trial." Thornton's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping slowly against the bench. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Submit it. Let's move quickly." Olivia stood, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a thick envelope and a flash drive, both labeled with meticulous precision. She handed them to the bailiff, who delivered them to Emily. The clerk plugged the drive into a laptop, and the courtroom dimmed. As a screen behind Thornton flickered to life, casting a cold blue light over the room, a voice crackled through the speakers, Coleman's voice, unmistakable in its smug cadence. "These people just can't stay out of courtrooms," he said, laughing. "It's either drugs or drama with them." Another voice, one of his fellow officers, responded with a joke about food stamps. The room stiffened, spectators shifting uncomfortably. Then another clip played, grainy but clear, recorded during a break in a different trial months ago. Coleman's voice again, boastful. "You just send the report to Thornton. He'll bury it so deep you'll forget it ever existed." A collective gasp rose from the back, reporters scribbling furiously, their pens no longer subtle. Thornton's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as if to anchor himself. Coleman turned sharply toward the screen, his lips parting, the blood leaving his face. His smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic that he couldn't hide. The prosecutor turned to Thornton, his voice steady but firm. "There's more, Your Honor, but we believe the court should hear directly from the witness, under oath." Thornton nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched, as if words had abandoned him. Olivia rose and walked to the stand, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and faced the room. Every eye was on her, every breath held. "I came to this courtroom as a witness," she began, her voice clear and unshaken, "but I was also here on assignment. For the past 10 months, I've been part of a federal investigation into patterns of racial misconduct, falsified evidence, and judicial corruption involving officers from the Richmond Police Department and members of this court." The room erupted. In whispers, reporters abandoning pretense to film openly, their cameras trained on Olivia. She continued, her tone steady as steel. "The operation was classified, authorized by the Department of Justice, and backed by multiple internal departments. I've spent months collecting statements from victims, compiling data, and documenting systemic violations that go far beyond this one case. What we found was a chain of complicity, from how reports were filed, to how cases were dismissed, to how officers like David Coleman operated under the protection of a judicial figure who turned a blind eye, not once, but repeatedly." Coleman shot to his feet, his face red. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's lying. This is insane." The bailiff moved toward him, but Olivia turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his with a calm that silenced the room. "You don't remember me, Officer Coleman," she said, her voice cutting like a blade. "But you should. 5 years ago, in Baltimore, you testified in a case where a teenager was wrongly accused of assaulting you during a traffic stop. That teenager was my brother, Jamal. He spent 6 months in juvenile detention before the charges were dropped. You were never held accountable, but I remember your face, and I remember your words." The courtroom was a tomb, the silence absolute. Coleman blinked, confusion and fear warring in his eyes. Olivia turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. "This is not personal vengeance. This is not an ambush. This is accountability. And the truth doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when it's necessary." The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice firm. "Your Honor, we are also submitting a request for your immediate recusal from this case, as well as a formal investigation into your conduct in relation to Officer Coleman and several previous rulings. The evidence shows not only misconduct, but potential criminal negligence." Thornton stared down, his hands trembling, his face a mask of defeat. The room buzzed with disbelief, spectators whispering, reporters filming. Emily's eyes wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. Coleman looked around, his bravado crumbling as he realized no one was coming to his defense. His lawyer whispered urgently, but he didn't move, his eyes darting to Olivia as if seeing her for the first time. The screen flickered again, showing a bank transfer, a private message between Thornton and Coleman, confirming the suppression of evidence in 3 separate trials. The prosecutor turned to Thornton. "Your Honor, the people move for the immediate detainment of Officer David Coleman pending formal charges. We also request federal oversight moving forward while the investigation expands." There was no protest, no defense, just silence. The bailiffs moved toward Coleman, who stepped back instinctively, his voice rising but shaking. "This is a setup. She tricked everyone. She's lying." But no one believed him anymore. His words fell flat, drowned by the weight of the truth dot as the bailiffs cuffed Coleman, leading him toward the main doors. The crowd outside roared, their voices filtering through the walls. Cameras waited beyond the threshold, ready to capture the fall of a man who thought himself untouchable. Thornton remained seated, his eyes fixed on the bench, his hands gripping the wood as if it could save him. Emily watched Olivia step down from the stand, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and fear. The man in the plain suit nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself, then slipped out of the room. The courtroom was no longer a theater of routine. It was a battlefield, and Olivia Harper had just fired the first shot. But even as the room reeled from her revelations, one truth lingered, unspoken but heavy. This was only the beginning. The system she'd exposed was vast, its roots deeper than Coleman or Thornton. And somewhere, in the shadows, a bigger player was watching, waiting to see how far she'd go. The Richmond District Courthouse was no longer a quiet monument to routine. By noon, its steps were a battlefield of noise and motion reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing like gunfire, protesters chanting names of those lost to the system's indifference. The arrest of Officer David Coleman and the disgrace of Judge Robert Thornton had ignited a fire that spread beyond the courtroom's walls. Its heat felt in every corner of the city. Social media buzzed with grainy clips of Coleman's handcuffed exit, his face pale, his bravado shattered. Headlines screamed of corruption exposed, and talk shows dissected the trial with feverish intensity. But for Olivia Harper, the woman at the center of the storm, the victory was not a moment to savor. It was a warning. The machine she'd wounded was still alive, and it was starting to bite back. Olivia walked through the federal buildings. Corridors, her coat buttoned to the collar, her satchel heavy with files. Her badge remained hidden, tucked inside a leather pocket, a secret she wasn't ready to reveal to the world. The task force room was a hive of activity agents poring over documents, phones ringing with urgent updates, a whiteboard now dense with new threads connecting names to bank accounts. Special Agent Sarah Nguyen stood by the table, her eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "The DOJ's moving fast," she said, handing Olivia a report. "Coleman's detained, no bail. Thornton's been suspended, and the court's under federal oversight. First time in Richmond's history." Olivia skimmed the report, her expression unreadable. "It's a start," she said, her voice low, "but we're not done." Natalie Carter, the assistant day, looked up from her laptop, her face taut. "With worry, we've got bigger problems." My office dug into Thornton's financials. "There's a trail leading to someone higher William Foster." Olivia's eyes narrowed. Foster, the state attorney general, was a political titan, a man whose reformist speeches filled auditoriums and whose face graced campaign billboards across Virginia. If he was the puppet master, The stakes had just climbed to a level she hadn't anticipated. Foster's been careful, Natalie continued. No direct transfers, but his office approved budgets that funneled money to cover settlements for Coleman's cases. He's the firewall, Olivia. Without him, none of this stays. Hidden. Sarah folded her arms, her voice sharp. Going after Foster means war. Not just Richmond, the whole state. Are we ready for that? Olivia didn't answer immediately. She thought of the courtroom, of Coleman's smirk, of Thornton's trembling hands. She thought of her brother, Jamal, and the countless others whose voices had been buried. We don't have a choice, she said finally. If we stop now, it's all for nothing. But the cost of pressing forward was already mounting. That evening, as Olivia left the federal building, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. You can't hide forever. She scanned the parking lot, her heart steady, but her senses razor-sharp. A black sedan lingered at the far end, its windows tinted, its engine idling. She memorized the license plate before slipping into her car, her hand brushing the pepper spray in her glove compartment. The sedan didn't follow, but its presence was a message. She was being watched. At home, she found a new email in her encrypted inbox, the subject line blank. The message was simple: back off, or you'll lose more than your case. Olivia deleted it, but the words lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. The next morning, she met Michael Reed in a deserted lot near the James River, the water's surface glinting under a cold dawn. The former cop looked worse than before, his eyes shadowed, his hands buried in his hoodie. They know I talked, he said, his voice low. Last night, someone slashed my tires. I'm leaving town, Harper. You need to watch your back. Olivia nodded, her face calm but her mind racing. I'll get you protection, she said. Just stay low. Michael handed her another flash drive, smaller this time. This is the last of it. Meeting logs, some from Foster's campaign office. He thought I was just security. He talked too much. Olivia took the drive, her fingers tightening around it. Thank you, Michael. This changes everything. Back at her apartment, Olivia played the audio. Foster's voice was smooth, polished, the cadence of a man used to winning. The public doesn't need truth, he said, laughing softly. They need direction. Give them a conviction or two, and they'll think the system's clean. The words sent a chill down her spine, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what she'd feared. Foster wasn't just complicit. He was the architect, a man who'd built his career on the illusion of justice while protecting the rot beneath. The drive was a weapon, but using it would mean stepping into a fire she might not survive. The pressure wasn't just external. Within the task force, doubts were creeping in. Sarah pulled Olivia aside after a briefing, her voice hushed. The DOJ's getting nervous. Foster's got friends in D.C. If we push too hard, they might pull the plug. Olivia's jaw tightened. They can try. This isn't their fight, it's ours. But Sarah's eyes were troubled. Olivia, you're the one in the crosshairs. If this goes south, they'll hang you out to dry. Olivia didn't respond. She knew the risk. She'd known it since the first threat, since the first night she'd sat alone with her files, wondering if the truth was worth her safety. That afternoon, Olivia drove to a small house on the south side of Richmond, its paint peeling, its porch sagging under years of neglect. The mother of a young man killed during one of Coleman's arrests opened the door, her eyes weary but fierce. I saw you on the news, she said, letting Olivia in. They sat in a living room cluttered with photos of a smiling teenager, his life reduced to memories on a shelf. I thought I'd feel better, the woman said, her voice breaking. But it's just pain, over and over. Olivia's throat tightened. I'm sorry we let it happen for so long, she said. The woman shook her head. You didn't let it happen. You're stopping it. That's enough for me. The visit stayed with Olivia, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. But the machine was closing in. That night, as she walked to her car, she sensed movement in the shadows. A figure stepped forward, too quick for her to react, and a hand grabbed her arm. Instinct kicked in, she twisted free. Her pepper spray raised, but the figure was gone, melting into the dark. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from clarity. They were desperate. That meant she was close. The next day, a meeting request came through official channels, formal but insistent. William Foster wanted to see her. Olivia debated ignoring it, but curiosity and strategy won out. She agreed to meet at an upscale restaurant downtown, a place where power brokers went to disappear. Foster sat in a corner booth, his suit tailored, his smile warm, as if greeting an old friend. But his eyes were cold, calculating, watching her every move. "I admire what you've done, Olivia," he began, his voice smooth. "It takes courage to challenge a system older than us all." Olivia said nothing, her gaze steady, waiting. Foster folded his hands. "But courage isn't always strategy. You're pulling at a thread that could unravel everything: funding, reforms, public trust. You bring me down. You don't just take out a man. You take out a movement." Olivia leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "So I should stop because it's bad for your brand?" Foster's smile thinned. "I'm offering you a way out. Resign quietly. The DOJ closes the file, cites insufficient evidence. In return, you lead a new initiative, statewide reform, your name on it." A seat at the table. Olivia held his gaze, her heart steady. "No." The word hung between them, sharp and final. Foster leaned back, his warmth gone. "You're making a mistake." She stood, her voice unwavering. "I didn't come this far to ask for permission." As she walked out, the restaurant's murmurs faded, replaced by the thud of her pulse. She knew what she'd just done. She'd drawn a line, and there was no going back. By the time she reached the federal building, an emergency meeting was underway. Sarah met her at the door, her face grim. "Foster's team just accused you of falsifying evidence. They're calling for a review of your credentials." Natalie, sitting nearby, looked shaken. "They're coming for you, Olivia. If they push you off this case, it all slows down. They'll bury it again." Olivia nodded, her eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond the window. "Let them try," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The fight was no longer just about Coleman or Thornton. It was about a system that thrived on silence, and Olivia was done being quiet. Outside, the crowd had grown, their signs now carrying her name alongside those of the victims. The city was waking up, but the machine was far from defeated. And as Olivia opened her laptop, the screen glowing with Michael's latest files, she knew the real storm was still to come. The city of Richmond pulsed with change in the wake of Olivia Harper's courtroom triumph. But across town, another battle was brewing in the heart of its police department. The precinct on the city's west side was a fortress of habit, its walls steeped in decades of unspoken rules and unchecked egos. Its reputation for racial tensions and internal strife had drawn the attention of reformers. And now, a new leader had been appointed to clean house. His name was James Carter, a 58-year-old black man whose weathered hands and steady gaze told a story of resilience earned through years of adversity. But James wasn't stepping into his role with fanfare or force. He had a different plan, one that would expose the truth from the inside out. James had spent 30 years in law enforcement, rising through ranks that rarely welcomed men like him. His career was a tapestry of strength and fairness, marked by a calm, measured approach that disarmed even the most hardened skeptics. He'd faced racism, both overt and subtle, from colleagues and superiors. Yet he'd built a reputation as a cop who listened, who de-escalated, who believed justice began with respect. But Richmond's West Side precinct was a beast of its own, its culture a toxic blend of bravado and impunity. James knew that walking in as the new boss would trigger defensiveness, posturing, maybe even sabotage. So he chose a bolder path. He'd start as an undercover trainee, a supposed rookie with no rank, no authority, no shield to hide behind. He'd see the department's true face, not as its leader, but as its lowest rung. On his first day, James arrived at the precinct dressed to disappear. His worn jeans, faded gray shirt, and scuffed boots were clean but unremarkable, chosen to deflect attention. His graying hair and slight limp from an old injury made him seem older, softer, and easy. Target for those who thrived on power games. He moved through the bustling hallways with a quiet demeanor, his eyes scanning faces, his ears catching fragments of conversations. Most officers ignored him, their glances fleeting, their minds on the morning briefing. But not everyone was so dismissive. In the briefing room, two seasoned officers, Ryan Mitchell and Thomas Hayes, held court among their peers. Both in their early 40s, they were the precinct's alpha dogs, their cocky attitudes and sharp tongues setting the tone for the room. Mitchell, lean and wiry with a perpetual smirk, leaned against the wall, his eyes locking onto James as he entered. Hayes, broader and louder, followed suit, his laugh cutting through the chatter. They exchanged a quick look, amusement flashing between them. To them, James was an anomaly, a middle-aged rookie who didn't fit the mold of the young, brash recruits they were used to breaking in. "Looks like we got a new special recruit," Mitchell muttered, nudging Hayes, his voice loud enough for James to hear. "Yeah, doesn't look like he'll last a week," Hayes replied, chuckling. "Bet he's here by mistake." James gave a polite nod, his face neutral, and took a seat at the back. Inside, he was cataloging every word, every glance. He'd expected resistance, but the open disdain was a revelation, a glimpse into the culture he'd been sent to dismantle. Mitchell and Hayes continued their taunts, their questions laced with mockery. "You sure you're in the right place, man?" Mitchell asked, his eyes glinting. "We usually get a different kind of trainee around here," James smiled faintly. "I'm right where I need to be," he said, his voice steady, unruffled. The other officers watched, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably. A young officer named Lisa, barely a year on the force, glanced at James with a flicker of sympathy, but said nothing, her eyes darting away when Mitchell caught her looking. James noted her hesitation, the way she gripped her coffee mug a little tighter. She wasn't part of the problem, but she was trapped in its shadow, too afraid to speak. The exchange was telling. Mitchell and Hayes weren't just bullies. They were the precinct's pulse, their influence shaping how others acted, how they thought, how they treated those they deemed beneath them. As the day unfolded, James played his role as the silent observer, moving through the precinct like a ghost. He sorted files, shadowed patrols, and listened to locker room banter, his presence barely registered by those who saw him as a nobody. But Mitchell and Hayes were relentless, their pranks escalating from words to action. During a break, they cornered him in a quiet hallway, their smiles sharp as knives. "Ever seen crime scene tape up close?" Mitchell asked, unspooling a roll of yellow and black tape with mock enthusiasm. Before James could respond, Hayes chimed in. "It's part of the initiation, rookie. Gotta get a feel for the tools." They moved quickly, wrapping the tape around James's torso, pinning him to the wall like a pinned insect. To an outsider, it might have looked absurd, a grown man taped across his shoulders and arms, his dignity stripped for a laugh. But James stood still, his head high, his eyes meeting theirs without a trace of anger. He understood that reacting would only fuel their egos, give them the power they craved. So he let them laugh, let them snap photos with their phones, let them walk away thinking they'd won. Bet you never thought you'd get this close to real police work, huh? Hayes sneered, pocketing his phone. Get used to it, rookie. We're just warming up. When the hallway cleared, Lisa appeared, her face flushed with embarrassment. She cut the tape away, avoiding James's eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. They do this to everyone. James dusted off his shirt, his voice calm. Not everyone, officer. Just the ones they think they can break. Lisa paused, her hands trembling, then nodded and hurried off. James watched her go, his mind turning. Her guilt was a crack in the precinct's armor, a sign that change was possible, even here. The pranks didn't stop. Over the next few days, Mitchell and Hayes piled extra tasks on James's desk, mocked his age, and questioned his ability to keep up. Careful, old man, Mitchell said, tossing a stack of files at him. Don't strain yourself. James completed every task without complaint, his composure unshaken, his mental notes growing. He saw how their behavior rippled, how younger officers like Lisa stayed silent, how veterans turned a blind eye. The precinct wasn't just broken, it was rotting from within, and Mitchell and Hayes were its loudest symptoms. One evening, James lingered in the break room, overhearing a conversation between a janitor named Marcus and a rookie. This place hasn't changed in 20 years, Marcus said, his voice low. They haze you, they break you, and if you're black or brown, they make sure you know your place. The rookie nodded, his eyes weary. James filed the words away, their weight settling into his resolve. He wasn't here to punish. He was here to rebuild. The department had scheduled a mandatory meeting to introduce its new head, and the morning arrived with a buzz of curiosity. Mitchell and Hayes lounged in their seats, their smirks intact, oblivious to the truth. James entered quietly, no longer in his worn jeans but in a crisp police uniform, his badge gleaming, his presence commanding. The station chief stepped forward. Please welcome our new department head, Lieutenant James Carter. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the creak of chairs as heads turned. Mitchell and Hayes froze, their faces draining of color, their smugness replaced by wide-eyed shock. James's gaze swept the room, lingering on them just long enough to see their panic. He stepped to the podium, his voice calm but firm. This department is built on trust, respect, and accountability, he said. I've seen behavior that falls short of those values, and it stops today. We're here to serve, not to dominate. From now on, we hold each other to a higher standard. Mitchell and Hayes sat stiffly, avoiding his eyes, their discomfort a palpable weight. Lisa watched from the back, her expression a mix of relief and awe. James concluded, his words ringing clear. Change is here. It's time we build a team that respects every member, every citizen, every story. As the room dispersed, Mitchell and Hayes slipped out, their confidence shattered, their whispers now about survival, not dominance. James stood alone, watching them go. He thought of Olivia Harper, whose fight he'd followed in the news, whose courage echoed his own. Their battles were different, but their purpose was the same, to dismantle systems that thrived on silence. And as he stepped into his office, the precinct's walls no longer felt like barriers. They were foundations, ready to be rebuilt. Richmond woke to a new dawn, its skyline shimmering under a sky no longer heavy with secrets. The city had been shaken to its core by Olivia Harper's courtroom revelations and the seismic shifts that followed. The Richmond District Courthouse, once a symbol of routine indifference, now stood as a beacon of reckoning. Across town, the West Side Precinct, long a fortress of toxic pride, was beginning to crack under the weight of James Carter's quiet revolution. Two battles, fought in parallel, had converged on a single truth. Justice was not a moment, but a movement, and its ripples were just beginning to spread. In the federal building, Olivia sat before a grand jury, her voice steady as she presented the final piece of her arsenal, an audio recording from Michael Reed's flash drive, capturing William Foster's chilling admission. "Give them a conviction or two, and they'll think the system's clean," Foster had said, his laughter a blade that cut through his reformist facade. The jurors listened in silence, their faces rigid, the weight of his words sinking in. Olivia's testimony was a surgical strike, tying Foster to the budgets that hid Coleman's settlements and the policies that shielded Thornton's rulings. She spoke not just of evidence, but of the human cost, the family silenced, the lives erased, the trust betrayed. When she finished, the room was still, the truth too heavy for applause. Within days, Foster's empire crumbled. The leaked audio dominated news cycles. His polished voice replayed across Virginia and beyond. His office issued denials, claiming manipulation, but the public's faith had shattered. Protests swelled outside the state capitol, demanding accountability. Foster resigned in disgrace, his indictment on charges of conspiracy and misconduct a formality that sealed his fall. The cases he buried were reopened, victims' families given new hearings, and Richmond's justice system placed under a federal audit that promised to unearth every hidden sin. Olivia's name became a whisper and a headline, not as a mod hero but as a force, a woman who'd flipped a table rather than beg for a seat. Yet Olivia sought no spotlight. She turned down interviews, book deals, and speaking tours, her mission rooted in change, not fame. Instead, she accepted a role leading Virginia's first independent division for civil rights and institutional accountability, housed in a modest blue building on Richmond's south side. The sign on the door read, "We hear you," and the chairs in the waiting room welcomed those whose stories had been ignored, families displaced by biased rulings, children wrongfully punished, survivors too afraid to speak. Olivia worked among them, shaking hands, learning names, her presence a promise that their voices mattered. The department wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, a legacy built on truth rather than applause. Across the city, James Carter's reforms took root in the West Side precinct. Ryan Mitchell and Thomas Hayes, once the precinct's loudest bullies, underwent mandatory training in empathy and diversity, their days now spent in community outreach programs. They walked the neighborhoods they'd once patrolled with disdain, listening to residents' stories, their attitudes softening under the weight of real connection. The change wasn't instant, but it was undeniable. Mitchell's smirk faded. Hayes' laughter grew quieter, and both began to see James not as a threat, but as a leader worth following. The precinct itself transformed. James's speech had set a new standard, and officers became mindful of their words, their actions, their impact. Lisa, the young officer who'd freed James from the tape prank, found her voice, reporting misconduct she'd once feared naming. At a community meeting, James stood beside residents, hearing their pain stories of harassment, of fear, of distrust. "We're not perfect," he told them, "but we're listening. And we're changing." The crowd didn't cheer, but they nodded, their silence a fragile trust he vowed to earn. One evening, at a conference on justice reform, Olivia and James met, their paths crossing in a quiet hallway. They shared no grand speeches, just a nod of recognition. Two warriors who'd fought the same war on different fronts. "You shook the city," James said, his voice warm. Olivia smiled faintly. "So did you. It's not over, is it?" James shook his head. "Not by a long shot. But we've got to start." Their brief exchange was a bridge, a reminder that their work, Olivia's in the courts, James's in the streets, was part of a larger fight, one that needed both their strengths. The city felt different now. The crowds outside the courthouse carried hope alongside their anger, their signs no longer just names of the lost, but calls for a better future. Victims came forward, their stories amplified by a press no longer content with silence. A retired judge endorsed Olivia's division, sparking similar efforts in other cities. Young activists, once pushed aside, now advise city leaders, their voices shaping policy. The silence that had protected corruption was fracturing, replaced by a chorus of demands for truth. Olivia stood alone one night in her apartment, a glass of water in hand, the city's lights flickering beyond her window. A letter lay on her table, no return address, just a single line. "Thank you for giving me my voice back." She read it twice, then tucked it beside a photo of her brother, Jamal. It wasn't closure, but it was peace, the kind earned through sacrifice, the kind that carried her forward. James, too, found peace in the precinct's slow transformation, in Lisa's courage, in the residents who now met his eyes without fear. Their victories were not endings, but beginnings, steps on a road that stretched far beyond Richmond. This story is a testament to the power of resilience and the courage to speak truth to power. Olivia and James embody a profound humanism, fighting not for revenge, but for those whose voices were stolen, whose lives were diminished by systems meant to protect them. Their stories teach us that justice is not a verdict or a badge, but its stories teach us that justice is not a verdict or a badge, but a kadias. Commitment to see and hear the unseen, to value every person's dignity. They remind us that change begins with individuals who refuse to stay silent, who choose purpose over comfort, and who believe that even the smallest voice can shift the world. The lesson is clear. We all have the power to challenge injustice, to listen, to act. Have you ever felt invisible in a room where you belonged? What would you do if you held the spark to change it? If this story moved you, if it stirred your heart or sparked a thought, join us at Legacy Stories. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and become part of a community that celebrates tales of courage, truth, and transformation. Hit that like button, share this story, and let's keep the conversation alive. Together, we can amplify the voices that need to be heard. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.